So we're live on Facebook.
Excellent.
So welcome, everybody. If you're joining us, my name's Simon Turpin. I'm the Director of Answers in Genesis UK, and we're a few minutes early tonight as we do this special Facebook Live. I'm just going to log on to Facebook and see how many people are watching, if there are already people waiting to get on. Let me just have a look. Then I'll do official introductions. Yeah, a few people watching already. So I'll just waffle while we wait till 7:30 and then officially start, as that was the start time. And so we're still continuing to do these live discussions as we sit our way through the coronavirus, and hopefully they've been a blessing to you. We're continuing to do these every night at 7:30, and we've put a list up on our Facebook page so you can see who's coming throughout the week. Tomorrow night, I think we've got a recording from Brian Edwards on evidence for the Bible. So he's looking at some of the archaeological evidence on the Old Testament tomorrow night if you tune in at 7:30. And then just to say, on Thursday night, we've got a really good guest. Dr. Calvin Basner is coming from, or joining us from the States, and he's going to be talking about stewardship of creation, climate change, and other issues. So if you want to join then. But tonight, I have with me Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson from the States. He's joining us from across the pond, a very big pond, but he's here with us. And we're going to look tonight at some of the common evolutionary criticisms of creation, or the biblical view of creation. Nathaniel's going to answer. I'm not going to answer them. Nathaniel is going to answer those questions, because we did a Facebook, it wasn't a Facebook Live, it was a pre-recorded Facebook maybe a week or so ago, and a lot of criticism came up. And so we want to try and answer some of those criticisms tonight. Just to let you know, Nathaniel is the author of Replacing Darwin, which looks at Darwinism genetically and shows a number of biblical predictions, or he offers a number of biblical predictions showing how the biblical model is superior to the evolutionary model. And he's also recently released a book, especially for people like me, Replacing Darwin Made Simple. And so really, it's a sort of a layman's version of Replacing Darwin. So if you want to understand where the creation debate is today, then you need to get hold of Replacing Darwin Made Simple. It's sold out. We've sold out of this already twice in our UK store. And so I'd recommend you get hold of one of those and hand it out to people in your church. Read it yourself so you can become familiar with the evolution creation debate where we are at today. So we've already got a number of people joining us. So Nathaniel, do you want to just introduce yourself really quickly and give a brief background to the work you do at Answers in Genesis?
Sure. I'm a biologist by training. I grew up in I guess you could say, a sciencey medical background home. My dad was a dentist. My mother was a nurse. And I grew up with medical discussions in the household, though I didn't want to pursue the track of working with blood. That still kind of creeps me out, and I look away when people take my own blood. But I ended up, ironically, for graduate school, I did my bachelor's degree, I should say, at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, which is a branch of the state system in Wisconsin, which is, if you're in the UK, it's sort of the Midwest, and went to do my PhD. I get ahead of myself. So the bachelor's degree, my 4-year degree, was in molecular biology and bioinformatics, which in understandable English is simply looking at life at the smallest levels, the chemical levels, essentially DNA, RNA, protein, these sorts of things. And bioinformatics is using computers to handle the ever-increasing amounts of genetic information that we're discovering. It is virtually impossible to do any sort of molecular biology research these days without a computer to handle the amount of information you can rip off overnight. So that was my background as an undergraduate, graduate student, did my PhD degree, went to Harvard on the East Coast, Boston, Massachusetts, and that lesser institution from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. Did my PhD in cell and developmental biology. So even though I disliked blood, I ended up working on the cells, the stem cells that sustain adult tissue, namely adult blood tissue. So I sacrificed probably 2,000 mice as part of the study, isolated their bones, all that sort of gross stuff, but learned to handle it. And then after graduate school, joined the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas, Texas for 6 years, where I was tasked with developing and advancing a biology research program. So we set out first to find the major research questions and then began to pursue them. And that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years. So 6 years, actually I'm probably now approaching 11 years, 6 years at the Institute for Creation Research, now close to 5 at Answers in Genesis. And Replacing Darwin really is a summary of the major findings as it relates to the origin of species. And if folks have been following the video series I've been doing with Ken Ham on the new history of the human race, that has also followed from it. Some of the predictions that have been made that I wrote down in Replacing Darwin, and some of the follow-up that I discussed in Replacing Darwin made simple. We're seeing it played out now at the human level in human DNA. And this will hopefully lead to then a third book by 2021, 2021 being the 150th anniversary of Darwin's book, The Descent of Man. He, of course, if you know the history, started off by trying to explain the origin of species globally, avoided the question of the origin of mankind for various reasons, and then about 12 years later decided to tackle it, and naturally argued for the origin of mankind from a lower primate, and human beings not being something special or made in the image of God, but the products of natural process over millions of years.
Yeah. And so you're continuing that series at the moment with Ken, or is it finished?
Continuing that, yeah. So we got through episode 8 yesterday on Sunday, though I guess by UK time when it's premiered, it's probably Monday, early Monday. We'll be doing episodes 9 and 10, looking at the history of Western Europe. So this has a lot of effect on UK residents. Much of, if you look at the history of immigration to the United States, so of course we're based in the United States and many of our viewers are Americans, the plurality of people, if you look at the history of immigration from the 1500s to 1975, came from the UK. So it's about 40% from the UK, and another 20% from the Mediterranean area, another 20% from Northern Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, and so forth, and then another 20% from Eastern Europe. So this has perhaps the most direct ramifications for the history of British, Irish, and so forth. And of course, especially then for Americans. And then in the weeks following, we'll be dealing with the history of the Americas before Columbus. Another way you could put this weekend's episode is the history of the Americas after Columbus. So we're going to look at before Columbus. We're going to look at some of the earliest histories and move backwards in time. We've been following a pattern of starting with the most recent history, the most recent branches on the human family tree, and then working backwards in time to the very beginning.
Okay, great. So you can, if you want to follow that, you have to go on to either Ken Ham's Facebook page or the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, and you can see all the videos Nathaniel's done so far with Ken Ham. But let's start by trying to answer some of these common evolutionary criticisms of biblical creation, because I saw last week one of the objections was that creationists basically do pseudoscience and they use the facts to fit their beliefs. So how do we answer that question? Do we need to define what science is first and foremost?
There's a shorter answer and a longer answer to that question. The short one is that the question itself is an example of the very thing they're trying to illustrate. In claiming that I fit facts to conclusions, the only way you can reach that conclusion is if you yourself fit facts to conclusions. And I should say this isn't something unique to Replacing Darwin. It's something that's been levied against creationists for decades. Thinking back to the legal history here in the United States, and I don't know the UK legal side, but I'm sure it's parallel because the evolutionists work in concert. In the early 1980s, there was a landmark legal case dealing with our state-sponsored school system here and the legality of teaching creation science alongside evolution. They said it was not okay to do so in the science class because creationism isn't science. And they say it doesn't make testable predictions. So a testable prediction is something where you make a statement and you see if future experiments can reveal it to be true or false. Something that's not testable, we already know it's true, and therefore we fit all facts to that preconceived conclusion. That's the opposite of that. And that sort of objection, evolutionists would say, has a legal basis then, at least in the United States, going back to the early 80s. And it's been repeated over and over again. You see it repeated not just by evolutionists, you see it repeated by the mainstream media. We've been interviewed here at Answers in Genesis countless times. I myself have been interviewed. If you go to the Answers in Genesis homepage and you look up me, or you look up the article titled, "When Hostility Helps," I describe one such encounter, a hostile reporter who comes in and gives a pretense of being fair and objective and just wants to ask a whole bunch of friendly questions. You see the printed material that comes out, and it's something very different, hostile, obviously, and they've gone to a whole bunch of other people to support their conclusion. One of the problems you'll see in that article is he is counting on the fact that I won't remember what we discussed. And I encouraged him in our interview, because they always ask us, how do we explain the fact that so many scientists, 98% or so, professional scientists, reject my conclusions? And I say, well, they aren't familiar with what we actually say. They don't read any of our papers. If you look at the mainstream educational system in the United States, and surely the same applies in the UK, no trained scientist is required as part of his education to read professional, creationist, scientific, technical literature. Most of them can't even articulate what creationists believe. You look at the major proponents, popularizers of evolution, who are also, at least in the past, research scientists: Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne, in his book Why Evolution is True, when he describes and discusses creation science, describes it in a manner that's very applicable to 1859, not 2020 or even 2009, which I think is when his book came out. He's acting as if we still believe in the fixity of species and so forth. So here's the leading people arguing why evolution is true and why creationism is false, and they can't even get the basic facts about the opposing side correct. Now, I argued to this reporter that this is the main explanation. It's simply ignorance. There's no conspiracy, because that's what they're looking for. They want me to say it's a conspiracy or something that sounds outlandish so they can put that in print and then make us look foolish. But I knew what they're looking for, and I gave him an answer that doesn't look foolish. So instead, what he did is he found other people, other PhDs to say, and so he can quote them, creationists fit facts to conclusions. What he failed to do, though, you'll see in this write-up, is ask these people if they've actually read my papers. Here's a great way to test my hypothesis, but he wasn't interested in testing my hypothesis. He was interested in fitting facts to his preconceived conclusion that creationists fit facts to conclusions. So it's an intensely ironic accusation, because in my experience, the only way you can reach that conclusion is to undermine the whole foundation for it. You fit facts to conclusions. Creationists do, in fact, make testable predictions. They do not practice pseudoscience. And I would argue, in light of what's happened the last 5 years, and looking at the response to my book, it's actually evolutionists who are on the defensive now, having to fit scientific facts to their preconceived conclusions. It's the science itself that's troubling them. It's the science itself that's fitting the creation model. And this is, in my experience, sort of a lazy way to get around dealing with the real scientific arguments. And it's a clever argument, because if you're not paying attention carefully, it's easy to say and have to defend it, when in fact the question itself is self-refuting, because the only way you can advance it and claim it is to fit facts about creationist science to one's preconceived conclusion.
Yeah. So we often find that evolutionists are basically not familiar with up-to-date creationist arguments. In fact, I remember, I think it was about 10 years ago, Jerry Coyne was part of a BBC documentary called A Creationist Road Trip, where the BBC invited, I think it was 4 or 5 young creationists over to America to take a road trip to be interviewed by leading evolutionists, to sort of get all the biblical teaching out of them, and so they could see the evidence. And they bumped into rather Jerry Coyne, and I think only one of the people on the road trip actually knew what he was talking about. In fact, I know he knows what he's talking about, because he works for a leading creation organization today, and it was clear Jerry Coyne had no idea what biblical creationists believe. So we do see this actively, don't we, in debates, or whether you meet evolutionists face to face.
So I guess, and I would add to this is, if someone says creationists fit facts and conclusions, you just say, give me an example, and see how many times they deal with the evidence in print that creationists make testable predictions. They're opening themselves up to falsification. They're putting themselves out there on a limb. See how many of them have read Replacing Darwin. That's not to toot my own horn. It's just an example of, if we're dealing with evolution, that's what we're dealing with in that book. And I'd be hard pressed to find someone who's dealt with it in a rational, responsible way, and in a way that they can defend the accusation that creationists fit facts to conclusions.
I know you try to get people, to read, scientists to read Replacing Darwin, but how many people have actually who've peer reviewed it from, the secular community? I think was the one guy in Sweden who did it, or is he the only one so far? Was there anyone else who's actually engaged you with your arguments?
There's a gentleman, I think in Denmark, who's essentially a professional troll. He has a PhD. I think he left the field a long time ago and became a math teacher, but essentially a troll. You can read our exchange on the AIG website. You go to the Answers Research Journal, where he tries to review. We had a couple of rounds of interactions, tries to review Replacing Darwin, misrepresents it, just does a very poor job. So I don't want to impugn the rest of the evolutionary community with his bad behavior. Yet, in a sense, it seems to be somewhat representative. I did the debate with the American evolutionary biologist Herman Mays in 2018, where he displayed very little evidence of having read my book, even though that was the explicitly stated subject of the debate. And if you read the write-up and read his blogs, you'll see that his stated, I guess you could say, strategy for debating creationists is simply to mock them. He has no interest, by his own admission, in engaging any of their arguments. So Jerry Coyne was mailed a copy, Richard Dawkins was mailed a copy, P.Z. Myers was given a copy, and my impression is they reacted to it the same way I've reacted to many up-and-coming, attention-seeking evolutionists who advance an argument, or biologos. When biologos initially came out, and they're the theistic evolutionary community started in the United States by Francis Collins. I think the Faraday is probably the UK equivalent.
Yeah.
I ignored them for a while, hoping just to see if they'd go away. I had no interest in giving them free publicity. Yet they grew in influence in the US Christian community, got into seminaries and so forth. So at some point, a tipping point was reached where, okay, now we have to say something. And in fact, I debated one of their PhD biologists, Dennis Venema. He's no longer officially a fellow with them, but he was when we did our debate at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So that was in spring in 2017, a few months before my book came out. He also seemed to be unfamiliar with what creationists actually say, or at least displayed very little evidence of having an interest in engaging the scientific arguments I advanced. In a sense, that was predictable, because they're a unique group in the sense that they're not interested in actually debating science. They accept without question what the mainstream community says, and are simply looking to gain acceptance in the Christian community. But they're an example of a strategy I took initially of, let's see if I can ignore them until they make enough noise. You have to engage them. And I have a feeling the evolutionists are doing the same thing. Ignore them as long as possible, which they can, because they're in positions of power. And some of them, in moments of honesty, recognize the circular argument they're advancing. Creationists don't do research. And I remember on one evolutionary blog, a forum, someone reflected to themselves one day and said, well, I guess it'd be kind of unfair for us to criticize them for not doing research when we don't allow them to have any money for doing research. But then the comment was left and they moved on. So there's a level of circularity what they're doing, but they can get away with it because of this overwhelming majority who are part of the professional community. It's a closed community in which the funding dictates what happens, and they're the gatekeepers. My hope is eventually the message gets out far and wide enough where they can't ignore it. In a sense, and maybe to take a more encouraging and give a more encouraging anecdote from history that is a precedent I hope we can follow. If you look at the pre-Henry Morris, Duane Gish days, and I think of these guys really as the pillars, the foundation of the modern young earth creation movement, the shoulders in which I stand and so many others. I grew up hearing Duane Gish and John Morris, Henry Moore, so forth. If you look at the evolutionary textbooks from, say, the 1950s here in the United States, and you look at the closing chapters, which, majority of the book in the evolutionary textbook is going to deal with evolution, not with creationists. They'll have maybe a small section at the end. I remember one of them had a letter to creationists basically saying, look, science and religion are two different domains. Keep it in the church, keep your religion in your church, and let's just do science in the classroom. It's fairly innocuous, I guess you could say, in the sense of it wasn't overtly hostile and condescending and that sort of thing. It was almost naive compared to the 2020 scenario in which we find ourselves. Then, of course, Morris writes his book along with John Whitcomb in 1961. This has a domino effect that, at least in the United States, the 1970s, leads to the foundation of the Institute for Creation Research, leads to all sorts of debates on university campuses, thousands of people coming out, students writing it up in the student newspapers saying what a great event this was. It catches the evolutionists off guard. By the end of the 70s, early 1980s, they regroup and have an organized opposition to it. And one of the consequences, I think, is you now see within evolutionary biology textbooks a whole chapter dealing with creation science arguments. Whereas in the 1950s, they could naively just dismiss it as something religious. And in the 1970s, they were caught off guard with that same mindset. The inroads that creation science was able to make among the general populace was strong enough that it forced a reaction from the evolutionary community. And my hope is that once this new material, which isn't replacing Darwin, it is new material. It is, to me, a game changer. It's written in light of these legal decisions made over the past 4 decades and renders them null and void. Once that gets out far and wide, enough people are talking about, the evolutionists are going to be forced to say something. And if they respond in ignorance, students aren't dumb. They go to college and they've read these books and they know the information, and they hear the evolutionist talking like he has no idea what he's talking about. They can see through that and they can sniff a rat. And my hope is that's the direction it goes. And we can repeat, in a sense, what happened with Morris and Gish. We don't see it necessarily reflected in the statistics among professional scientists, what they hold to. But you can see that evolutionists were forced to say something. And again, to me, the evidence is strong. It doesn't take a PhD to see the design of life. Even Richard Dawkins recognizes the design inherent in life. The battle is on what does the evidence actually say? What does it mean? And I don't think it, again, takes a PhD to recognize what the evidence says. And even the evolutionists' best arguments against our view, which for years has been the lack of testable predictions, no longer applies. It was their favorite last resort. So we're early, to me, in this new stage of the debate. And my hope is that at some point we get beyond the early stage, the message goes out, people, even among the creationists and Christian community, say, okay, this is what they're saying. This is how this new work refutes it. And students are prepared once they go off to college, university, to, hey, professor, don't you know that creationists actually make predictions? No, they don't. Well, have you read Replacing Darwin? No. Now you've got a whole new debate. So my hope is that sort of slow fuse burns for a while and leads to the sorts of results we saw with Morris and Whitcomb, and then goes beyond that.
Yeah, which is why if you haven't read Replacing Darwin or Replacing Darwin Made Simple, you need to get a copy so you can give it to people in your church or your family who are about to go off to university, study biology, and so they're familiar with the arguments and can respond to their evolutionary professors. But I notice another common question or a common argument that comes up, and maybe this is more of a lay argument, because lay people or Christians will often respond to evolutionists and say, well, evolution can't explain the origin of life. And evolutionists will hit back and say, well, evolution isn't about the origin of life. It's about the enormous and diverse assortment of all the living things that we see today. Is that true? Is evolution about the origin of life, or is it only about once life starts and about all the living things that we see today?
I want to answer this question directly, and then it'll wrap back around to something else I want to say about these books. Not to toot my own horn, but there's a purpose I had in mind when I wrote these, and what I'm trying to accomplish with it. So, there's a sense in which the evolutionary response is true yet not true. So, is evolution divorced from the origin of life? Well, it depends how you define it. If you define evolution as descent with modification, evolution by natural selection. Well, evolutionists will say you can't have that process occurring until you have the first self-replicating organism. You can't have descent until there's something that can produce descendants. And you can't have that until you have the first self-replicating organism, which is, after, by definition, the origin of life. So in one sense, by the evolutionists' own admission, and there's a weakness in what they're doing here, it doesn't have a lot to do with evolution. Let me tell you the weakness real fast, and then tell you how it does have something to do with evolution. The weakness then is that some of the evolutionists' favorite rebuttals to other anti-evolutionary arguments don't apply. So a favorite thing you'll hear, especially in lay discussions between evolutionists and, let's say, lay critics, is, well, probability doesn't apply to evolution. You can't be talking about the probability of a certain thing evolving or not evolving, because evolution is non-random. And what they mean is the process of descent with modification, evolution by natural selection, is not just a roll of the dice. The roll of the dice is the mutations that happen, but natural selection is this process, the survival of the fittest to reproduce. That's the non-random element to it. It's not just a roll of the dice every generation, which new traits, which new DNA mutations pop out. That's the roll of the dice step, and then natural selection is supposed to filter through it. Well, what we just said is natural selection doesn't apply at the origin of life because there's no self-replicating organism by definition. What that means then is, and here's the weakness, probability arguments do apply. So every argument about the origin of life is statistically impossible. You cannot, as an evolutionist, explain it away by saying, well, evolution is not random. It is random by definition at this stage because you do not have a self-replicating organism. So every probability argument applies. And of course, we know, and you can look this up in creationist literature, intelligent design literature that doesn't even endorse the Christian God. They recognize there's gigantic probabilistic hurdles to getting the right chemicals at the right place at the right time, and on the challenges go. So in one sense, the origin of the first life doesn't deal with evolution if we're talking about descent with modification, but in another sense it does. Let's take the argument further. So if we say, okay, Mr. Evolutionist, the process of descent with modification doesn't begin until you have the first self-replicating organism. Now let's deal with what happens thereafter. They want to insist that we must not ever invoke a designer or any sort of creation science. Leave God out of it. Well, if that's the philosophical approach you're going to take, then philosophically, the origin of life is part and parcel of it. If they're going to insist leave the designer out of every discussion after the origin of the first cell, well then, by extension, and they want to explain everything without a designer, that's a problem you have to explain. They can't suddenly say no designer after the origin of the first life, but a designer before it, and that's just not the way the modern mainstream scientific community works. They are philosophically wedded to it. They have to explain it as part of their overall attempt to explain the origin and diversity of all life apart from any sort of divine design, strictly by natural processes. If they insist on explaining everything by natural processes, the origin of life is part of the going from the Big Bang to life today. So it's philosophically wedded. You cannot divorce it. Even if evolutionists wanted to, it's something they can't extricate themselves from. So either way they answer the question, they've got a problem. If they say, no, evolution doesn't apply until you have the first self-replicating creature, okay, you've got to then explain, you've got to recognize that probability does apply to the first self-replicating creature. And if you're going to say, well, it's not wedded to evolution, well, look at how you behave after we talk about the origin of the first life. You're insisting on excluding the designer. And so philosophically, you must then explain how you get the origin of life without a designer. And that's, of course, a famously sticky and intractable problem.
Yeah, because there is no natural explanation for the origin of life. Naturalism can't account for the origin of life.
No, it's probabilistically, it's a statistical miracle. And one of my favorite articles I read back in the day, and I don't remember the exact title of it, the source, may have been something like Fish in a Bathtub, just to give people a helpful comparison for the types of probabilities that we're discussing. Because when you talk about 10 to such and such power, we're often having to remove the cobwebs from parts of our brain and math we haven't used for many years. It just doesn't have much meaning to the average layperson. Well, the fish in the bathtub was helpful comparisons, analogies to understand the chance of the first life happening. And so someone would say, well, there is a chance that all the atoms in the room I'm sitting in, the atoms in the room you're sitting on, all the oxygen atoms in the respective rooms in which we're sitting could collect themselves in the corner and we could asphyxiate. There's a chance, there's a probability that this might occur because there's the gases in the air are bouncing back and forth. There's a chance they could just happen to bounce and collect in the corner, we could all die. No one stays awake at night wondering if they're going to be alive the next morning because the oxygen atoms in the room have collected themselves in the corner and you've asphyxiated. Or the way the article started was a conversation between a creationist and evolutionist, and the creationist says, looking at a bathtub, what's the chance, asking the evolutionist, do you really think it's plausible that the chemicals in this bathtub could, over 1 million years, spontaneously evolve into a fish? And the evolutionist thinks for a moment and says, no, it's impossible. But in 1 billion years, it might be possible. So this concept of incomprehensible amounts of time being the rug under which we sweep all the problems of evolution. And they know that incomprehensible amounts of time, by description and definition, are incomprehensible. And so people sort of, well, maybe it is possible. Yeah. And these sort of analogies help people realize, no, it's effectively impossible. It's ridiculous to believe that. Yet the evolutionists hope that these gigantic numbers and impossibly small probabilities, because there's still this tiny chance, all you need is one time for it to occur. Well, again, no one believes that in day-to-day life. No one believes that the oxygen atoms in this room will collect themselves in the corner. No one believes that a football that's deflated will spontaneously inflate if we wait long enough. There's all sorts of infinitesimally small probabilities dealing with everyday occurrences that no one waits to happen. No one believes it's true. We act as if effectively it's impossible. The same thing applies to the origin of life. It can't happen. Laws of chemistry and physics effectively forbid it.
Yeah. I think there's a famous quote, isn't there, from the evolutionist George Wald in the 1950s, who talks about time itself will perform the miracles. One only has to wait, and time itself performs the miracle. So they do need the miraculous for the origin of life, or for the origin of the universe. There was another objection, I think, that was raised the last time we spoke. One of the many trolls that I guess follow you around managed to come on our page, and they pointed to an article actually written by a theistic evolutionist. I think, is it Joel Duff? And he was basically saying, well, that the young Earth model of speciation is a recent invention, so therefore it doesn't apply. How do we answer that criticism?
I want to deal with his specific claim and then deal with Joel Duff himself, since he's got a whole blog on an archive of arguments against speciation. He's a professor of biology across the river here. I'm in northern Kentucky. Across the Ohio River is the state of Ohio. He's at one of the universities in Ohio, biology professor there. So he has students that regularly go through his class, and apparently has enough free time as a professor to spend lots of it blogging about young earthers and all their problems. There seems to be a pattern of him blogging about Ken's tweets more than anything else, but that's the second thing I want to say. His objection that the young earth model of speciation is a recent invention is in one sense true and in one sense not true. First, let's think about the history of the modern term species. You look at biology textbooks and they'll talk about the history of that term is going back to Linnaeus. Well, Linnaeus is the 1700s. So basically, every model of speciation is a recent invention because the term species is a recent invention. It's not really a worthwhile objection if you think about it. Now, what he wants to say is, of course, in the history of Christendom, it's a recent invention. Again, the biblical perspective on internet pornography is a recent invention because internet pornography is a recent invention, but the biblical principles are ancient, going back to the beginning. So when he's saying it's a recent invention, he wants to make it out as if, and really if you read into his literature, the point he's trying to advance is a form of the objection we discussed at the beginning, namely that creationists fit facts to conclusions, and that early on, even in the 1700s or so, when people believed in the fixity of species, that creationists back then held to that view. They did not hold to this concept of kinds, where the kind is more akin to the family level, where there's 30 plus species of cats in the cat family, as an example, from lions and tigers to house cats. He's saying that the modern creationist view that the 30 plus species of cats descend from a pair on board the ark, that's a recent invention. You go back to the 1700s, you don't see it. And the reason it's a recent invention is because as the number of species that we've known has increased, this has created problems. So if you look at the history of when species have been named, there's been a dramatic increase, of course, since Linnaeus. We're still discovering new species to this day. And so he's saying early on, creationists could get away with the historical view that the kind is the same thing as species, because you could easily fit the number of known species on board the ark. Then at some point, a tipping point was reached where the number of species exceeded the capacity of the ark, and oh no, we have to go back and fit facts to conclusions. We have to revise our views of how the kind is understood. We have to bump it up to the level of family so that we can still maintain the global flood and the survivorship on board the ark. That's really the extended version of his objection. The factual answer to that is Linnaeus himself modified his view. He was an early proponent of the fixity of species. If you look at his later writings, because of breeding, he began to adopt something very close to the modern young earth creationist view. Darwin himself was unaware of this when he wrote The Origin of Species. And if you've read The Origin of Species, you know his primary punching bag, so to speak, the primary position he's attacking is the view of the fixity of species. And he does a pretty good job demolishing it. He doesn't do such a good job arguing for the universal common ancestry of all species. I think it was Charles Lyell who later in life, after Darwin had published his book, informed Darwin, hey, you know that Linnaeus changed his view. Darwin didn't know that. And apparently Duff is following then in Darwin's footsteps of being ignorant of this. So of course, if the view of Linnaeus is that species are not fixed, but they're descendants of the kinds on board the ark, and the kinds are fixed, this has the effect of rendering many of Darwin's arguments null and void, because he's arguing against the fixity of species. So to summarize, I guess that the answer to Duff's objection, is it a recent objection? In one sense, a recent invention, this view of the species from kinds, species from families. Yes, because every view of the origin of species is a recent invention. The biblical position on internet pornography is a recent invention. The specifics are, but the exhortations against lust, of course, go back to Jesus, and even further back in the Old Testament. So it's really sort of a clumsy and sloppy critique, because the creationist view of species from kinds goes back to Linnaeus himself, which is the beginning. It's hard to get any more close to the beginning than Linnaeus himself when you're talking about models on the origin of species. And that's the bottom line. Is it the creationist view goes back to Linnaeus, and modern creationists have been following in his footsteps. And even Henry Morris, back to at least 70 years ago, he was articulating something similar. So the father of modern young earth creationist movement is arguing something along those lines. Now, with respect to Duff himself, there's something people should know, because he's a favorite, his website is a favorite one that people cite on other blogs.
Can you just tell people the website, just so they know if they come across it?
Yeah, I think it's Naturalist Historia. He calls himself a natural historian. There's some history, though, that's relevant to our immediate discussion. He started this, I think, some years ago. His primary focus, almost exclusive focus, is trying to refute young earth arguments. You'll notice very little discussion of the arguments I've been advancing. His favorite topic is lay-level presentations, to which he tries to give a scholarly response. As far as I'm concerned, that's a pretty lazy way of doing it. If you're a PhD, you should engage the scholarly literature. It's like me spending all my time engaging National Geographic instead of what the evolutionists are actually publishing. It's not anything that should be taken seriously, really. It's not a professional activity. It's a hobby with someone who's got a PhD behind his name. So most of his criticisms are ill-informed. He has virtually nothing that engages what I've published in replacing Darwin. Someone asks him in one of his comments, so I'm telling you all this because I have read lots that's on this blog, and directly responded to arguments on this blog, arguments also on the BioLogos website, to which he doesn't seem to have bothered to try to either take down or respond to my responses. He recently said, so all this to say, he recently announced he would no longer be blogging about the young Earth creationist problems and instead focus on something else. So I find this rather ironic that once there's a book replacing Darwin. So this, I should say this. He did mention replacing Darwin and said he would be closely watching the response to my book instead of actually engaging its arguments. So he decided he would watch the response to the book, never actually engage the arguments for the book, and within a short amount of time, a couple of years, he decided he would stop blogging about young Earth creationist arguments. So a lot of what he's written is irrelevant. And sadly, what I see is it seems most in the mainstream scientific community ignore young Earth creation science. There's a few who will pretend to engage it. You've got Herman Mays, who doesn't even bother reading it, just wants to mock it. Joel Duff tries to engage it and then drops out when the discussion gets intense, is what it appears to me at least. And then everyone else who's got some sort of interaction with creationists will cite these people who've done sloppy criticism as evidence that creation science doesn't work. So it's sort of a vicious circle of people doing a half-baked job trying to engage what happens. That's not a woe is me, poor creation scientists. It doesn't matter to me whether they engage it or not. It has immense relevance to the debate and the almost universal objection that creation scientists and lay creationists hear. Why do so many people disagree? Well, this vicious cycle of sloppy criticism. They don't bother to read what we do. And then the few who do a lousy job get cited by all the rest. So no one's actually engaging what creationist scientists say. And then they wonder why there's still creation scientists around doing what they do and wondering why we object to their sort of behavior and the logic of their arguments. That's really the bottom line. It isn't something personal. It isn't necessarily someone's character. It's look at the logical deficiencies in what he's doing. He's arguing against an idea that he doesn't bother to research. So it makes for a whole bunch of straw man arguments, which of course are logically vacuous and represents nothing close to a rebuttal to what creation science have printed.
Yeah, when the person posted that link last week, I did look on his blog, and all he seemed to do is set up straw men, knock them down, and then say, "Yay, we win." So essentially, yeah. And so you don't. The interesting thing is, like you say, you don't see these PhD theistic evolutionists or evolutionists actually engage with the literature. Once again, we don't see them engage with the literature, so they don't know what we're saying or what you guys with the PhDs are saying about biblical creation. So they are essentially just knocking down straw men and then saying to people, "Yeah, we've destroyed it." I remember when I was studying Old Testament and I handed my professor a book on biblical creation, and he said he would read it. I came back to him about 6 months later. Had he read it? No. And he did admit to me, I don't want to read it. So I mean, why do you think people in the academic community, is it just a pride thing? Is it just, we don't want to go there because if we have to engage, then we might have to take this serious?
I can't speak to motives. I do know that objectively there would be a major loss of status and reputation for someone to be sympathetic to, especially to a young Earth view. And at least in the US culture, to say you believe in 6,000 years is the secular equivalent to swearing. That's heresy, that's something dirty, you should be considering an insane asylum if you're talking like that. That's how they view it within that secular worldview. So who wants to be a lunatic? Who wants to be labeled a lunatic? There's strong pressures to avoid that. I can't say about their motives, but I know that objectively there are strong pressures to resist it. Now, another thing I want to say, since we're talking about Joel Duff, and this is especially relevant to the Christian community, and is relevant to the question, I think, of why people avoid it, because there might be more at play here. And again, I'm not talking about motives. I want to talk about a list of facts that speak especially to the theistic evolutionary community. Not all theistic evolutionists, and we've said many times the answers in Genesis, you can hold to evolution and be a Christian. But there's some behavior on the part of people at BioLogos, and this is what I'm more familiar with on this side of the pond, not so much the Faraday behavior, but there might be parallels. It wouldn't surprise me, because sadly, there's a lot of playbook overlap among theistic evolutionists and secular evolutionists. So it wouldn't surprise me if theistic evolutionists on both sides of the pond do the same thing. Anyway, what I'm about to say deals with BioLogos. I've watched their behavior. I think they're probably going on a decade now of activity from the initial movements, probably back in 2009, and making noise to where they are today. Their initial push and their consistent push for many years has been, we're all about humility and gracious dialogue. Joel Duff wrote an article for them, and I wrote a response to Duff's article, and I titled it, "Does BioLogos Strive for Dialogue?" It's a long essay, but it's in a sense a rhetorical question. I'm pretty sure you won't see any response to what I said on their website. It's consistent with their behavior. Their mantra, their MO has been to get into seminaries to gain acceptance among the mainstream community, but their explicit mission has been humility and gracious dialogue. The evidence to support their pursuit of that mission is not only dramatically missing, it contradicts it. So here's, I think, what's really going on. Young Earth creationists are labeled as divisive and contradictory and peace rejecting, because we say this is the creation issue is a near category 1, near cardinal doctrine. It deals with biblical authority. There's a lot going on, and people should not compromise. The BioLogos message has been on theological issues. No, we need to allow for lots of different positions on this particular issue and allow for diversity in the Christian community. We need to have dialogue and humility and allow for this sort of acceptance. So they've positioned themselves as the side that is all about peace and humility and other good sounding fruits of the Spirit, while painting their opponents as the opposite of that. If you look at their behavior, that's what they push and push and push and push on the theological side. On the scientific side, they label creationists liars, which is about as far away from humility and gracious dialogue as I can think. So you can find an article I've written on our website, "Does BioLogos Strive for Dialogue?" You can find another one, something along the lines of, "Are creationists liars?" I did a response to Dennis Venem's book, Adam and the Genome, which was his book he wrote, I think, around 2017, saying the genetic evidence is in opposition to the existence of an initial pair of people. Adam and Eve do not exist in genetics. And I was writing a response to this and highlighted from the book and elsewhere, I should say, I can't remember exactly what that article highlights, but I know I've done that there and elsewhere, highlighting where they essentially call anyone who disagrees with them scientifically liars, misrepresenting. They don't even entertain the possibility that there's a legitimate scientific position to be considered in young Earth creation science. It's essentially, you disagree with the mainstream community, you are wrong and a liar. So here's what I'm trying to show in this discussion. You have an organization that makes as its brand humility and gracious dialogue, and they pursue that incessantly on the theological side, but they do the exact opposite when it comes to the science. And again, what I'm pushing here is not something personal. This is not, I'm here to judge motives or anything. I'm telling you, this is what's documented and factually in print. This is what they do. Essentially, they are advancing a falsehood. They are presenting themselves one way and doing the opposite. Now, you might say, well, young Earth creationists are arguing for a strong, hardline stance in theology, and they want acceptance in the scientific side. So aren't you two just doing the same thing? No, here's the difference. Young Earth creationists don't go around calling for humility and gracious dialogue. We call for unflinching, uncompromising adherence to Genesis and for rational approach to science. BioLogos calls for unflinching, uncompromising approach to humility and gracious dialogue, and then does the opposite. So what does that tell you about someone's character? Again, I'm not saying theistic evolution is a position that makes you not a Christian. What I am saying is if someone, an organization, advances for years upon years a mission that is fundamentally dishonest, and then they claim and name the name of Christ, what does that tell you about their state? So there's a great danger, I think, not just in the theological positions that they're advancing, but in the pattern of character by the leading proponents at this organization. And again, I'm speaking to what I've seen at BioLogos, because this is what I've read fairly exhaustively, and I've had lunch with Gerald Falk. I've personally interacted, debated with Dennis Venema, Jim Stump. The leading people at this organization are people I've personally contact with, read their materials, and this is what I see, and this is what they don't want you to know. It's hidden. It's present in print, but it's behind the scenes. I'm saying, if you look at the evidence carefully, they're essentially advancing a false front. Yet they're naming the name of Christ, and that to me is a serious concern and a serious pattern of behavior every Christian who's considering this should wrestle with and consider.
Yeah, I know over here in the UK, I mean, BioLogos is in the US, Faraday Institute in the UK, theistic evolutionary sort of institute similar to BioLogos. There's a leading theistic evolutionist in the UK. I won't name him, but has basically come out in a book and said young Earth creationists are heretics. So it isn't about gracious dialogue. In fact, this man is very popular among Christian university students, trying to help them to be a witness in the university system, but yet he can come out and call young Earth creationists heretics. So again, yeah, it's not about gracious dialogue, whether you're in the US or whether you are in the UK, which is a major problem.
Yeah.
Let's look at a last question to try and help people who may be trying to combat evolution with people that they know. How does because you've set this forth in your book, I know, how does cell biology falsify the Darwinian belief that every complex component of life rose step by step?
I'm going to give a couple of answers to this, and I come back to a point that I said I was going to make but forgot to earlier. When I think of how do you falsify Darwinian evolution step by step, I think of Michael Behe's work, Darwin's Black Box, which came out in 1996. And Dennis Venema himself, speaking of BioLogos, has tried to rebut it. I point out the gross errors and misrepresentation in Venema's work. And again, it's crazy to me to think that Dennis Venema has 20 years to try to find a flaw, and the best thing he can do is misrepresent or miss the argument, with all that time to come up with something, one example of a problem with in Behe's work. Behe's argument, again, he's not a creationist. He has no problem with humans and chimpanzees having a common ancestor. He's no problem with billions of years of the history of the universe, but he does have a problem with Darwin's mechanism, mutations and selection, being sufficient to account for life. And he makes a fairly airtight argument. And he points out from Darwin's own words, this isn't a creationist invention. Darwin himself said, if you can find something that cannot be built by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And Behe's point is that there's numerous examples at the cell biology level, biochemical level, of systems, components in which there's multiple mutually interdependent parts that by definition cannot be evolved by natural selection. Step by tiny step, you have to have all the components come together at once or the system fails. Selection has to select for something. You can't just have this piece evolve, do nothing, this piece evolve, do nothing. Well, you can, but then you have a probability argument, and that natural selection argument about it not being chance, that goes away, and you're back to basically the problem of the origin of life, which is statistically impossible. You need a miracle. So evolutionists need to have selection to avoid the probability problems in their arguments. And Behe's book refutes it excellently. And again, I'm giving caveats of he's not a creationist, so be aware of that. But his is, to me, one of the most sound, airtight arguments against evolution. And I wrote my book, Replacing Darwin, in that context. And this is the point I was going to make earlier about the origin of life. I wrote my book, Replacing Darwin, knowing the historical problems, long-standing problems of the evolutionary origin of life, the long-standing problems, as Michael Behe has documented in Darwin's Black Box, and wrote mine to complement that. So you will not find in Replacing Darwin Michael Behe's argument, because I thought his book stands alone on itself. People can read that. Mine deals with, well, what does the evidence look like? Or to put it this way, Behe's book deals with the question of, can evolution happen? Is it mechanistically possible? My book deals with, did evolution happen? does the evidence support it as plausible and as the best explanation? And I argue from multiple lines of evidence, multiple independent lines of evidence in genetics, anatomy, physiology, so forth, fossil record, it points to the creation of kinds. We've got testable predictions that flow from this. It's a superior argument to evolution. So again, I wrote it to not have to repeat what other people have written about the origin of life, repeat what Behe has written about Darwin's black box. I did bring in some of his arguments in Replacing Darwin Made Simple, because it's, to me, a key part of the toolkit when dealing with evolutionists. Say, first of all, hey, it's impossible. You can't evolve male and female without male and female, as a simple example, both being present there at the start. So in my mind, there's multiple paths to take, there's multiple tactics to take. And again, Replacing Darwin Made Simple, the second part of the book deals with is basically a simple guide to how to engage an evolutionist when they say, here's the problem. Or if you're a parent, you have a student come home, evolution is wrong, here's why. I should say I wrote Replacing Darwin. The primary audience I had in mind when I wrote Replacing Darwin was students. Thinking of, okay, you've got a student going off to college, you've got a student in biology class, maybe you're a Christian student, and you've got a classmate. Of course, evolution is true. That's all we ever heard. You hand it to them, and A to Z, it takes them from where they're at and leads them to, here's the creation science conclusions, ends of the gospel. Replacing Darwin Made Simple is designed to help those who are creationists, maybe not biologists, maybe not students. That, it was a long time ago when I said that. What's the bottom line? It gives you, in a nutshell, part one of the book in Replacing Darwin Made Simple. Here's how species form in a very understandable way. Part two is, here's what we do with that information. Here's how you might engage. Let's say you're a Christian student. You're a parent who's gone off to university, come back and said, I don't believe this anymore. Well, why? Here's what they'll say. Here's how you respond. Here's what they'll say. Basically, 5-step process of here's what they're more likely to have heard in class and repeat back to you. And here's how you can respond to them and give them questions to think about. So in my mind, the most effective strategy, especially when it's someone close to you and they've claimed to have left the faith, I don't see direct confrontation and argumentation as being that effective, because people leave the faith, claim to leave the faith, and it's usually has to do with pride, and they take a lot of pride in the arguments they've come up with to reject it. They're not going to admit they've been wrong suddenly in front of the people closest to them. You plant questions that, after they've blustered and claimed they reject everything you've just said, questions they can't shake as they go off to their room, go home, go wherever, back to university, and in the quietness of privacy of their dorm room or wherever they're at. Well, how do you explain the origin of male and female? What do you do with the fact that the major evidences for evolution are equally explicable by creation? What do you do with the fact that creationists do, in fact, make testable predictions that are working and are explaining, as we're doing in the series with Ken Ham, human history? These sorts of questions then will hopefully gnaw at them, and at some point they have to wrestle with them and deal with them if they're honest with themselves. And of course, you need to pray. For Christians, we know this is ultimately a spiritual issue. Romans 1 says people suppress the truth. Richard Dawkins knows the truth about God and nature. He recognizes it looks designed, but he desperately wants you to believe that it's not designed, and convinces himself, suppresses the truth that it's not designed. They need a change of heart that only the Holy Spirit can do. So the book is designed to help you, to our viewers, to help you. Replacing Darwin Made Simple is designed to help you engage people in a very practical way. And then at the end of the day, once you've done your part, pray for their soul, pray for wherever they're at. Again, and if they're theistic evolutionists, they can still be Christians, but pray that they'd repent of their erroneous views about the scriptures and the injustice they're doing to Genesis, and the glory of God that they're missing in advancing something in direct contradiction to the scriptures.
Yeah, it's a great point to point out that we do need to pray for those who we come into contact with, not just try and defeat their arguments, but to pray for them. But yeah, we want to present the arguments, but we also need to spend time in prayer for them. So I'm just going to give people maybe a minute or two. If anyone is watching and you want to ask Nathaniel a question, please do try and quickly write it down in the comment section, and I'll try and get to that. But just a reminder, and hopefully if Neil is watching, Neil can put a link to these in the comment section. Nathaniel's book, Replacing Darwin. Again, if you know someone who will eventually get back to going to university, then this is the book for them. If they're doing one of the sciences, get them a copy of Replacing Darwin. Dealing, as Nathaniel said, he gives you testable predictions. He gives you evidence why evolution is wrong. Multiple strands of evidence, as he said. If you don't have a science background and you think it might be too complicated, then this is why he's written replacing Darwin. I think it's only not even, it's about 88 pages long. I read this in about an hour over a cup of coffee. You can hand this out to people in your church, and it's a great witnessing tool as well if you want to hand it to someone who is steeped in evolutionary thought. This will make them think again. Yeah, I can see Neil said he's put the links to the books there. Well, I can't see. Let me just have a quick check for any questions. I can't see any coming through. So I'll just have to say thank you to Nathaniel. I think we are going to do something maybe another time on Adam. Is that right, Nathaniel? Can we do something on Adam? Because I've noticed over the last few weeks there's been a lot on, especially YouTube, on theistic evolutionists trying to say there never was the first man, Adam. You can accept the evolutionary origin of life, and there were people before Adam and Eve. So we're going to tackle that question because it's obviously a hot button issue. So we're going to look at that. And I think Nathaniel, I've written a book on Adam. I know Nathaniel has written a chapter on Adam and genetics in a book called Searching for Adam, which we do Answers in Genesis. And by the way, just so you know that these books are available at our web store, and we're currently doing 20% off all our resources. All you have to do is type in Matthew 6 when you go to the web store, and you'll get 20% off all the books. So a number of comments just saying, thank you, Nathaniel. People appreciate you spending time with us and giving us answers to some of these questions. So again, thank you everyone for watching, and Nathaniel, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So God bless everyone and take care. Thank you.